Imagine vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only a single word carved into a wooden post as the sole clue to your fate, and that mystery enduring for over 4 centuries with no definitive answer. Haunting historians, archaeologists, and curious minds alike as they try to piece together what happened to you and your community in those final desperate days. This is the story of the lost colony of Roanoke, America's oldest unsolved mystery. A tale that begins with ambition and dreams of a new world, but ends in an enigma so profound that it has captivated generations, spawned countless theories, and challenged our understanding of early American history. In the summer of 1587, 115 men, women, and children stepped onto the shores of Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, carrying with them the hopes of establishing England's first permanent settlement in the New World. But within 3 years, they would disappear so completely that their fate remains unknown to this day. And the story of what happened to them is far more complex and fascinating than most people realize. To understand the lost colony, we must first go back to 1584, when the story truly begins with the ambitions of one of England's most flamboyant and controversial figures, Sir Walter Raleigh, a courtier, soldier, poet, and explorer who had gained the favour of Queen Elizabeth I and received from her a charter to explore and colonise the New World in England's name. Raleigh, who never actually set foot in North America himself, sent an initial reconnaissance mission that year under the command of Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, and these explorers made contact with the native Algonquian peoples of the Outer Banks region, establishing what initially appeared to be friendly relations through trade and gift exchanges that created a sense of mutual curiosity and cooperation. The expedition returned to England with 2 Native Americans, Manteo and Wanchesin, members of different tribes who agreed to travel across the Atlantic, learn English, and serve as cultural intermediaries, though their experiences in England and their ultimate paths would diverge dramatically in ways that would shape the fate of future colonists. In April 1585, Raleigh dispatched a much larger expedition of 7 ships carrying approximately 600 men under the military command of Sir Richard Grenville, with Ralph Lane, a soldier who had served in Ireland, appointed as governor of the settlement that would be established on Roanoke Island. This first colony was primarily a military outpost designed to serve as a base for privateering operations against Spanish ships and to claim territory for England. But it quickly ran into trouble as supplies dwindled. Relations with the Native Americans deteriorated under Lane's aggressive and paranoid leadership, and the harsh realities of survival in an unfamiliar environment became brutally apparent. The colonists depended heavily on the local Algonquian tribes for food, particularly corn, but Lane's policy of intimidation and his demands for provisions created resentment and fear among the native population, and by the spring of 1586, tensions had escalated to the point of violence. Lane became convinced that Wingina, the chief of the Roanoke tribe, was plotting to starve out and attack the English settlers. And in June 1586, Lane launched a preemptive strike that resulted in Wingina's death, an act that shattered whatever trust had existed between the two peoples and set a precedent of violence that would poison future attempts at cooperation. When Sir Francis Drake arrived at Roanoke Island later that month with his fleet, fresh from raiding Spanish settlements in the Caribbean, the colonists were so desperate and demoralized that they begged to be taken back to England, and Lane and his men abandoned the settlement, leaving behind only a small garrison of 15 men to maintain England's claim to the territory. These 15 soldiers were never heard from again, becoming in effect the first lost colony of Roanoke, though their disappearance has been overshadowed by the more famous mystery that would follow. And when a supply ship sent by Raleigh arrived shortly after Drake's departure, the captain found the fort abandoned and those 15 men vanished without explanation. Despite this disastrous first attempt, Raleigh remained committed to establishing a permanent English presence in America. But his vision for the next expedition was fundamentally different. This time he would send families, not just soldiers, creating a true colony of settlers who would farm the land, build homes, and establish a lasting community. In May 1587, 3 ships departed from England carrying 115 colonists, including 17 women and 9 children, under the governorship of John White, an artist and gentleman who had been part of the 1585 expedition and had created beautiful watercolor paintings documenting the native peoples and natural world of the region. White's instructions from Raleigh were to pick up the garrison of 15 men left behind and then proceed north to the Chesapeake Bay area, where the colonists would establish their new settlement in territory that offered better harbors and more friendly native populations. But those plans would never materialize due to a decision that continues to puzzle historians. When the expedition reached Roanoke Island in late July 1587, the pilot of the fleet, a Portuguese sailor named Simon Fernandez, who was also serving as chief navigator, refused to take the colonists any farther, insisting that they disembark on Roanoke Island instead of continuing to the Chesapeake. And the reasons for this crucial decision remain unclear, though theories range from Fernandez wanting to resume privateering operations to disagreements with White about the best location for settlement. The colonists found the fort from Lane's expedition overgrown and abandoned, with no trace of the 15 men who had been left behind except for a single skeleton, and they set about rebuilding and establishing their settlement, despite the less than ideal circumstances, and the knowledge that this island held dark memories of conflict between English and native peoples. On August 18th, 1587, just days after their arrival, John White's daughter Eleanor Dare gave birth to a baby girl who was christened Virginia Dare, making her the first English child born in the Americas, a distinction that would later transform her into a powerful symbol of American origins and lost innocence, though the real Virginia Dare was simply an infant caught up in circumstances beyond anyone's control. The colonists struggled from the beginning with limited supplies, the challenges of building shelter and establishing farms before winter, and the difficult task of repairing relations with the Native Americans after the violence of the previous expedition. And it quickly became apparent that they would not survive without additional provisions and reinforcements from England. In late August, less than a month after arriving, the colonists urged Governor White to return to England and arrange for desperately needed supplies, a request that placed White in an agonizing position because it meant leaving behind his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, and all the people who depended on his leadership. But he eventually agreed, believing that he would return within a few months. White sailed for England on August 27th, 1587, establishing with the colonists an agreement that if they needed to relocate during his absence, they would carve their destination into a prominent post or tree, and if they left under duress or danger, they would also carve a Maltese cross as a distress signal, a simple plan that would later become the only clue to their fate. When White arrived in England in November 1587, he found a nation on the brink of war with Spain, and his timing could not have been worse, as Queen Elizabeth I had issued orders that no ships were to leave English ports because every available vessel was needed to defend against the massive Spanish armada that was being assembled to invade England. White tried repeatedly to organize a relief expedition, but his efforts were frustrated by storms, shipwrecks, privateers who were more interested in attacking Spanish and French ships than delivering supplies, and the all-consuming focus on the looming Spanish threat that made his colonists seem like a distant and secondary concern. In 1588, the Spanish Armada arrived and was defeated by the English fleet, and terrible storms in one of the most famous naval battles in history. But even after this victory, White found it impossible to secure ships and support for a return voyage to Roanoke, and the delays stretched from months into years as he grew increasingly desperate and frantic about the fate of his family and the colonists. It wasn't until August 1590, 3 long years after he had left, that John White finally managed to return to Roanoke Island as part of a privateering expedition that agreed to make a detour to the colony. And what he found when he arrived would become one of the most haunting moments in American history. As White and his men approached the island on August 18th, 1590, exactly 3 years to the day after Virginia Dare's birth, they saw smoke rising from the woods and fired cannons and played trumpets, hoping to signal their arrival to the colonists, believing that they might be nearby and preparing fires to greet the rescue party. The next morning, White went ashore and made his way to the settlement site, his heart surely pounding with hope and dread. But when he reached the place where the colonists should have been, he found only silence and abandonment. The houses had been taken down, the area was enclosed by a palisade wall that hadn't existed before, and there was no sign of the 115 people he had left behind. On one of the posts of the palisade, carved in clear letters, was the word CROATOAN, and on a nearby tree, the letters CRO had been etched into the bark. But there was no Maltese cross. No sign of distress, which according to the agreement meant that the colonists had left of their own accord rather than under attack or in danger. White interpreted these carvings to mean that the colonists had relocated to CROATOAN Island, modern-day Hatteras Island, about 50 miles to the south, which was home to the CROATOAN tribe led by Manteo, the Native American who had traveled to England and remained friendly to the English throughout all the expeditions. White desperately wanted to sail immediately to CROATOAN to search for his family and the colonists. But a severe storm hit the area. The ships lost their anchors. Supplies were running low, and the captain of the expedition refused to risk the ships and men any longer, insisting that they return to England. And despite White's pleas and protests, they sailed away, and he never returned to America, never learned what happened to his daughter, his granddaughter, or any of the colonists he had been forced to abandon. For over 4 centuries, the question of what happened to the lost colony has haunted researchers, and the mystery has only deepened as new evidence has emerged that suggests the answer is far more complex than any single explanation. One of the most significant discoveries came from tree ring analysis conducted in the 1990s by scientists who examined ancient bald cypress trees in Virginia and North Carolina, revealing that the Roanoke colonists arrived during the worst drought in 800 years, a 3-year period from 1587 to 1589, when rainfall was so scarce that crops would have failed. Freshwater sources would have dried up, and both the English settlers and the Native Americans would have been struggling desperately for survival. This environmental catastrophe provides crucial context for understanding why the colony might have failed, or why the colonists might have made the decision to abandon Roanoke Island and seek refuge elsewhere. And it suggests that the colonists may have been dealing with circumstances so dire that their disappearance wasn't mysterious at all, but rather a logical response to environmental conditions that made survival impossible. Recent archaeological investigations have provided tantalizing clues about where at least some of the colonists might have gone. And 2 independent research teams have uncovered evidence that suggests the colonists may have split into multiple groups, seeking refuge with different Native American tribes in different locations. On Hatteras Island, where the CROATOAN tribe lived, and where the carved words seem to direct White, archaeologists have discovered European artifacts from the late 16th century, including a sword hilt, pieces of English pottery, parts of guns, a gold signet ring, fragments of a slate writing tablet with letters still visible, copper objects, and other items that seem to be personal possessions rather than trade goods, all mixed in with Native American artifacts in ways that suggest long-term habitation and cultural blending. Scott Dawson, a local researcher who has spent decades investigating the Hatteras connection, argues passionately that the evidence clearly shows the colonists relocated to live with the CROATOAN people, that they were never actually lost, but rather made a deliberate and sensible decision to join with Manteo's tribe, and that the mystery exists only because later English colonists and historians refused to accept that their countrymen would choose to assimilate with Native Americans rather than maintain their English identity. Meanwhile, another research team led by the First Colony Foundation has been investigating a site on the Albemarle Sound, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, after researchers discovered a hidden symbol on a 1585 map, drawn by John White, that had been concealed beneath a patch. And when this tiny four-pointed star was revealed using modern imaging technology, researchers theorized it might mark the location of a secret fort or refuge that the colonists had discussed as a backup plan. Excavations at this site, called Site X, have uncovered English pottery from the late 16th century. Metal hooks, copper aglets, and other artifacts in association with the Native American pottery, suggesting that some of the colonists may have moved inland to live with tribes along the Albemarle Sound, possibly splitting off from another group that went south to CROATOAN. These archaeological findings align with later reports from the Jamestown colonists, who arrived in Virginia in 1607 and heard stories from Native Americans about English people living among the tribes. Stories that some colonists were living at a place 2 days' journey from the head of the river, and accounts that suggested the Roanoke colonists had survived for years, but had ultimately been killed in warfare between Native American groups. The evidence increasingly suggests that what happened to the lost colony wasn't a single catastrophic event. A massacre, a hurricane, or a mysterious disappearance, but rather a gradual dispersal and assimilation as the colonists, facing impossible conditions during the worst drought in centuries, made pragmatic decisions to abandon their settlement and seek shelter and support from Native American communities that might help them survive. This explanation, while perhaps less dramatic than theories of Spanish attacks or supernatural disappearances, is actually far more interesting because it reveals the complex realities of early colonial life, the ways that cultural boundaries could be crossed when survival demanded it, and the uncomfortable truth that some English colonists may have chosen Native American life over their own culture. A possibility that later colonial propagandists and historians found difficult to acknowledge or accept. The lost colony of Roanoke remains officially unsolved, and despite all the research, archaeological discoveries, and historical analysis, no one has found the definitive smoking gun that conclusively proves what happened to every single colonist. But the accumulating evidence paints a picture that is both more mundane and more fascinating than the enduring mystery might suggest. What we do know is that 115 people faced impossible odds in an unfamiliar land, arriving during the worst drought in centuries, attempting to survive in a place where previous English settlers had committed violence against the native population, dealing with limited supplies and no support from England during years of international war, and ultimately making decisions that allowed at least some of them to survive by integrating with Native American communities, leaving behind their English settlement but not necessarily their lives. The story of Roanoke is not really about what happened to the colonists in the end, but about what their experience reveals about the early colonial period, the thin line between survival and disaster, the complex relationships between English settlers and Native Americans that could shift from friendship to violence and back again, and the ways that human beings adapt and make impossible choices when faced with circumstances beyond their control. The single word CROATOAN, carved into that post, continues to resonate through American history, not because it's mysterious, but because it represents a moment of decision, a path taken toward an uncertain future, and the lost possibilities of what might have been if circumstances had been different. If the drought had broken, if White had returned sooner, if the colonists had been left in peace to build their settlement, and if history had unfolded in ways that allowed their story to have a different ending. Today, as researchers continue to excavate sites on Hatteras Island and the Albemarle Sound, as DNA studies attempt to trace genetic connections between modern populations and the lost colonists, and as new technologies allow us to examine old maps and documents in ways that reveal hidden information, we are closer than ever to understanding what really happened. But the full truth may forever remain just out of reach, obscured by the passage of 4 centuries, the absence of written records from the colonists themselves, and the reality that some historical mysteries cannot be completely solved, no matter how much evidence we gather. The lost colony of Roanoke endures in American consciousness as a powerful symbol of the fragility of colonial ventures. The courage required to cross an ocean into an unknown world, the tragic consequences of poor planning and worse timing, and the fundamental mystery of vanished lives that once lived and breathed and hoped for futures that never came to pass. And perhaps that is why we remain so captivated by their story. Because in their disappearance, we see reflected our own fears about being forgotten, about the impermanence of human endeavors, and about how quickly a community, a dream, or an entire way of life can vanish, leaving behind only questions and the faint traces of evidence that archaeologists sift through centuries later, hoping to reconstruct what was lost. The 115 colonists who landed on Roanoke Island in 1587 could not have imagined that their names would be remembered 400 years later, that their disappearance would spawn books, theories, archaeological expeditions, and endless fascination, or that the word they carved into a wooden post would become one of the most famous clues in American history. But their story survives precisely because it ended in mystery rather than certainty. And in that mystery, we find space for imagination, speculation, and the eternal human desire to solve puzzles that resist easy answers, making the lost colony of Roanoke not just a historical event, but a legend that will continue to captivate and intrigue as long as people wonder about the past and the unknowable fates of those who came before us. If this story left you with questions, click on the video you see on the screen and uncover what really happened to the 9 hikers at Dyatlov Pass and how their lives came to such a brutal and mysterious end.